Okay, hello. Welcome to my talk, Early Maths Matters, deepening our understanding of great mathematics teaching for our youngest learners. I just want to say a big thank you to the organisers of Research Ed Norwich for obviously inviting me here to talk to you today, and also to you at home, wherever you might be in the UK or who knows, even around the world. Thank you very much. My name is Simon Cox. I'm Mathematics Content Specialist for the Education Endowment Foundation. I've also been a mathematics teacher in Blackpool for about 16 years now. And it is confession time. I am not an early years specialist. I'm actually a secondary maths teacher. So what I tell you today will be around the evidence and what we found in our evidence review, rather than coming from my own personal experience of early years. So just a little bit first about what we do at the EEF and how it links to mathematics in the early years and Key Stage 1. So we think of our work as broadly fitting into three strands, the first of which is synthesis, and this is bringing together existing evidence and research, whether it be UK-based or international, into evidence reviews, evidence summaries, and probably most famously the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which is certainly the most accessed part of the EEF website, and one that now most school leaders around the country are aware of. Probably less famous is the Early Years Toolkit, which is also on the EEF website, and does feature a strand on early numeracy approaches, which is well worth looking at. Another strand of our work is generation of evidence, and what we do here is we look for where there might be gaps in the evidence base or certain places where we think it's worth further exploration, and we commission trials, which are usually randomised control trials, and these take place over quite a significant period of time across a significant number of schools or settings. So often up to sort of 200 schools or settings might be involved in these. And these are all published on the EF website, and we collect the most promising of those into what we call the promising projects. And there are a number of early years and Key Stage 1 maths related trials which are actually featured in the promising project. So you can see one on the screen there, first class at number, and there's a few other ones in there as well. So again, worth exploring that if that's suitable for your setting. And finally, mobilisation. So this is where we look to get the evidence into schools, speaking to school leaders, speaking to teachers about how they might best implement the evidence within their setting to improve, in this case, mathematics outcomes. So we had a guidance report on Key Stage 2 and 3 maths that came out a couple of years ago now. And more recently, in January of this year, we've had the Early Years and Key Stage 1 guidance report come out. Both of those are examples of reports that we produce to help schools to mobilise the evidence. We also have our Research Schools Network, and this is a really wide-ranging group of schools. There's 40 now dotted around the country, and these range from nursery schools all the way up to sixth form colleges, who work with other schools to put evidence into practice. So wherever you are in the country, you probably won't be too far from a research school. If you go on the Research Schools website, you'll be able to find the one that's nearest to you. So why do we think mathematics in the early years matters? Well, it matters because we know that this gap between disadvantaged children and their non-disadvantaged peers exists, and we know that it grows wider as those children move through school. So our best chance, if you like, of narrowing or even eliminating that gap is where it is narrowest, which is in the early years. So we really do think there is a really important role for early years and Key Stage 1 to play in the narrowing of the disadvantaged gap, which is our core purpose at EEF, is looking into ways to narrow that gap. We also know that the early understanding of number in particular is a very strong indicator of future success in mathematics, and that those children that grasp number in the early years are much more likely to be successful later on in school in mathematics. Not only that, but it actually predicts overall academic achievement throughout the whole range of subjects. So that early understanding of number is really, really critical to future academic success. And we also know, disappointingly, that once children fall behind, they're unlikely to catch up. So it's really important that we get it right wherever possible the first time, when we're not relying on interventions and so on later on. because we know, unfortunately, the evidence suggests that they are, whereas they might make a difference in some cases, in general, children that fall behind are unlikely to catch up. So because of all of those and a number of other things, we really do think that early maths matters. We're going to explore a little bit during this talk the guidance report I mentioned earlier, which is the one that came out in January of this year, Improving Maths in the Early Years in Key Stage 1. It's freely available on the EEF website if you want to download a copy and have a read through. It's about 30 to 40 pages in total, and is a summary of the evidence that we looked at as part of the evidence review. And it was quite a lengthy process that we went to produce this report. It took about 18 months in total, from the initial scoping, where we made the decision that we would make this report cross-phase, early years and key stage 1. The reason for that was partly because we found that the best bets, the sort of things that we would suggest or recommend that schools and settings do to improve maths, were very similar for early years as they were for Key Stage 1. Now, we understand that there are pedagogical differences. There's obviously difference in curricula between those two phases, but the best bets for improving mathematics were very similar. So that was one of the reasons why we decided to make it cross-phase. And our experience of working with schools in Key Stage 2 and 3 on the guidance report that we published a couple of years ago have taught us that there's real value in practitioners from across different phases coming together, discussing, particularly in things like research called training. We made a point of getting Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 teachers together, and that proved to be really powerful and really valuable. And one of the things that a lot of schools have said was a real one of the best parts of taking part in that training was that cross-phase contact that they might not ordinarily have. So again, we decided for those reasons that it was going to be a cross-phase report. It went through a process of appointing an evidence reviewer that was led by Jeremy Hodgson, and conducting an evidence review, which we are going to publish soon. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Through to the writing of the guidance report, we had an expert panel put together to help with that. We were really keen with this report for as many practical examples as possible to be part of that. So Sue Gifford, who was part of the guidance report writing team, wrote a lot of examples of how this might look in practice, and I think that they are really valuable and really useful. And finally, consultation, and then into the phase that we're in at the moment, and we're about to start the writing of training to support settings and schools to implement the findings of this report. So, as with all guidance reports, there are a series of recommendations. There are 5 in this case. They're there on the screen. You can read those in a bit more detail in the report. Obviously not time to do those justice within the short session that we're looking at today. So I'm intending to focus in just on recommendation 2, which is about dedicating time for children to learn mathematics and integrate mathematics throughout the day. So with this recommendation, there's a number of different strands to it that I'd like to explore. But the first and really important thing that we found was that it's important to dedicate time at some point in the day for purposeful mathematics activity. And we also found that explicit teaching was really important in order to develop the mathematics in our youngest learners. Now, we need to be careful though when we talk about explicit teaching, because it conjures up all sorts of images of children sat in rows, all facing the front, listening to the teacher. That, of course, is not what we mean when we're talking about explicit teaching for the early years and Key Stage 1. We're talking about play activities. We're talking about active, short, playful mathematics, and we're talking about short and frequent. And the evidence did find that short, frequent sessions were likely to have the biggest impact with this particular age range. Also, a variety of different ways of teaching the mathematics. So through storybooks, through games, through puzzles, rhymes, puppet play, songs, lots and lots of different ways, and that variety and that richness was found to be really important. Now, there was a number of areas in particular which had particularly strong evidence, and one of those was through the playing of games, and in particular board games which have linearly numbered, equally sized spaces. So we've got snakes and ladders board there. They're all square. They're all the same size. They're all arranged in the usual counting order. And similarly with the caterpillar game on the other side, they are all circles. They go from 1 up to 20. All the circles are the same size, and those were the things that were found to be particularly important. Also, the idea that games, board games, should support counting on. And that was the way that they would be used best, according to the evidence that we found. I have to say, personal preference, looking at those 2 game boards there, is for the caterpillar one. This is purely anecdotal and comes through working with my own 3-year-old. I find that it's quite confusing when the numbers on the snakes and ladders board switch direction on each row. So 1 to 10 goes that way, and then 11 to 20 goes that way. And also, if we're thinking about later mathematics and using number lines, it's much better to have a number line that goes left to right rather than right to left. So personal preference for me is the caterpillar one, but the snakes and ladders board would be valuable. And I think an aspect of that that's really important is that that's something that people are likely to have at home as well as maybe in school. So encouraging parents to use these kinds of board games with their children at home is likely to be something that the vast majority of parents would be able to engage with, rather than something a bit more in depth. So for those reasons, games came out really strongly in the evidence review and obviously made their way specifically into the guidance report. Another aspect of teaching explicit mathematics was through the use of storybooks. But we found that it was really important that the books were used in a particular way. So use of storybooks can be effective, but only when practitioners are explicitly supported in promoting mathematical discussion from the story. One of the studies that went into the evidence review actually used cue cards. So the practitioners had discussed the story, they decided how it linked to the mathematics that was currently being studied. They thought of some particularly useful questions to support the learning of that mathematics that came out of the storybooks, and they had those on cue cards so that when they were reading with the children, they could remind themselves of the questions that they had decided that were best to support mathematics being learned. So that kind of process, rather than just finding storybooks with numbers or some mathematical connections and using those. The important thing here is the connection to the mathematics currently being learned and the careful consideration of the types of questions that practitioners are going to ask. There's a series of questions actually that I've put on the screen there, which are kinds of prompts that might be used. So, have you identified what mathematical content is contained within this book? How does that link to the mathematics that the children are currently learning? Has your team discussed and identified the kinds of mathematical questions to be asked during the reading of those books? Will any vocabulary require pre-teaching? And also, is there opportunities then to further develop that vocabulary throughout the day and to keep bringing those words back in different contexts? And has there been discussion of appropriate mathematical follow-up activities that might lead on from the reading of these books? So that kind of package of thinking is the kind of way that the storybooks might work to support learning of mathematics, according to the evidence that we found. One other interesting aspect actually here, which I haven't got on a slide here, but was using puppets in the learning of mathematics, and what we found was through the evidence review that children are much more likely to identify a mistake when the puppet makes a mistake rather than when the child themselves makes a mistake. So a simple example, if the puppet was counting from 1 to 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, the child is much more likely to pick up the fact that the puppet missed out the number 6 than if they were themselves counting to 10 and missed out the number 6. They're much less likely to pick up on that. So that was a really interesting finding from the review, this use of puppets, of teddies, to almost like model doing it wrong and seeing if the children pick up on that as being a really interesting form of assessment, actually, as to whether or not they are counting correctly. There's an interesting section within the report on assessment and forms of assessment and how it might look in the early years in Key Stage 1. And that is one aspect that I think comes out of this that is particularly interesting. We've talked about discussion then in the context of storybooks, but discussion in general also fits into this second recommendation. And this idea of extended discussion about mathematical ideas being really important. Models like sustained shared thinking and guided interaction work really well with mathematics, and really prompting and extending that conversation with the children through question stems like, how did you, why does this? So you think that a really useful prompt for practitioners to use in getting that discussion going, because that discussion is really, really important according to the evidence review. Lots of open-ended questions, asking children to elaborate, recapping key ideas, clarifying ideas, showing genuine interest, reminding, suggesting, all those different things are things that came out as being strong and important in the early learning of mathematics. Also thinking about vocabulary, again, we mentioned it in the context of the vocabulary needed to access the storybooks, but thinking particularly about the vocabulary that we use with children, it was found that consistency was really important. So different practitioners using the same terms and vocabulary with the children was found to be important. So deciding, how are we going to talk to the children about this? What words are we going to use? What words are important? And making sure that we're all sticking to those words. It was found that informal language was important. So referring to shapes as curvy or pointy, and for example, but then gradually moving towards a more formal approach to language. So correcting children, for example, when they use the word big when they should have used tall, is important in that development of the mathematical understanding. There's also a number of things within the report, and again within recommendation 2, about the opportunities throughout the day which we might find for developing the mathematics. So things like how children self-register when they come in to the setting in the morning, snack time and the opportunities for mathematics during snack time, opportunities taken when lining up and thinking about how we use vocabulary like who's first in the line, who's second in the line, and so on. How we might utilise other activities, some more general play, and how we might discuss sort of shape and mathematics within other activities that are going on. So using opportunities throughout the day to pick up on mathematics. What was found to be really important there, though, was that it was really carefully thought through. Again, coming back to the storybooks, this idea of careful consideration and planning of how this is going to work, rather than just sort of bolt-on activities, if you like, where mathematics is quite surface. So thinking about the mathematics that's currently being studied or learned by the children, and what mathematical activities could we find throughout the day that link to that? So, for example, again, just thinking about something like counting from 1 to 20, let's say, using self-registration in the morning in a tens frame to then count the number of children that are in the setting on that particular day, or in a particular group within the setting, using those opportunities to support the mathematics that you want those children to be learning, rather than just a bolt-on activity. Again, during snack time, thinking about opportunities to discuss things like sharing and things like one more. This was another area where we found that deliberate mistakes were particularly valuable. So having 8 children, for example, and only 7 pieces of fruit, and encouraging the use of the vocabulary one more, where it links to that being a particular mathematical idea that you're trying to get the children to grasp at that time. So again, with that idea, the planning is critical, and thinking about how it fits in, how it's going to progress over time. So how are we going to tweak the activity? For example, that might move from counting forwards to counting backwards, for example, and how we're going to develop these ideas is particularly important to according to the evidence base. So I just wanted to briefly discuss what next for the report. So the report's been out about 6 months now. please do have a thorough read through it. Obviously, we've only just skirted around one of the recommendations there, but there's 5 in all, and there's a lot more examples than the ones that I've just provided. So over the coming months, we're looking to focus in particular on 3 aspects of the report. The first aspect is the one that I've just been talking about, the mathematical moments and the idea about embedding mathematics throughout the day. The second is around developing understanding, particularly practitioners' understanding of how children develop their mathematical ideas, and also around manipulatives, which is also something that links closely to later schooling, so Key Stage 2, 3 and 4. There's also strong evidence for the use of manipulatives. I'm just going to focus in, though, again on the first one of those, because that's the one that we've been talking about today, and some of the things in the pipeline to support schools and settings in implementing the ideas from this. So the first thing we've got coming out is an audit tool, and this is a RAG rating document where settings can really look at where they are now and the areas in which they think they might want to develop and how they might go about doing that. We found that to be really useful with the Key Stage 2 and 3 reports, because we are not suggesting for a second that any setting or school should be looking to implement all 5 of these recommendations straight away. It's about picking the ones that are most relevant to your setting, to your children, to your practitioners, and to where you are at the moment. And we're hoping that the audit tool will help with that. We've also got the full evidence review coming out, the one that Jeremy Hodgson led on. That provides a lot more information about the studies that went into the report, which ones were included, which ones were omitted and why. And that will be coming out hopefully this side of the school summer break, so in the next few weeks. In terms of supporting resources then for settings and schools, we're working on a couple of animations which will illustrate some of the ideas that come out of this first recommendation. So, for example, we're thinking about ways of encouraging parents, for example, to find the mathematics and discuss mathematics with their children throughout the day, and also some examples of how that might work for settings and schools. So a few animations which will be coming out to illustrate those things. But then also, one of the things that I've stressed, I think, throughout this this talk is this need for careful consideration and planning. So a number of tools around planning those mathematical moments and how they link to the mathematics being studied, and also planning for the use of storybooks and how they link to the mathematics being studied. So we'll have a series of prompt questions, of planning tools, and other things, and exemplifications as well, because I know that people find those really important, really useful, sort of how other settings have put these things into practice, and how it has worked for them. Thinking also around the discussion stems, we mentioned things like sustained shared thinking, so developing some further question stems for practitioners to discuss and think about the way that they might incorporate some of those questions within their settings and with their children. Always thinking about examples of all these things in practice. And also we think it's really important to provide voices from the classroom. So what are other settings and schools doing to implement these recommendations? How does it work in practice for them? And we've got a series of blogs coming out soon, actually, from the Research School Network and some nursery schools and Key Stage 1 settings around the kind of things that they have done around the recommendations from this report. And there's one in particular around the storybooks, which links really nicely to some of the things that I've been talking about this morning. So keep your eye on the EAF website for more information about some of those things which will be emerging. I think the key thing here to take away is that early maths does matter. It matters hugely for a number of reasons that we've talked about already. But the report that's come out there shows that there are some key things that we can do to support schools and settings in implementing some of the evidence that's out there. And I think particularly in terms of this one that we've talked about today around these mathematical moments and the storybooks and the planning for those things throughout the day, I think there's some really sort of simple, clear messages there that we can take away and look to implement within schools and settings. But do watch out for those tools coming soon, which will help to support with that. So thank you very much for listening. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this great lineup at Research Ed Norwich this weekend. My email address is there on the screen if you have any questions, either about the report or the tools that are coming out soon, or you have some suggestions for, you might be one of the voices from the classroom, for example, that's implementing some of these ideas really well. Please do get in touch. And obviously, once we are through this dreadful pandemic time, I'm looking to get out into as many sort of early years and Key Stage 1 settings as I can, seeing some of these things in practice and supporting the use of the report within schools and settings. So thank you very much. I hope it's been useful.